welcome to the Advertising Hour with me, Scott Colnut. Today with me is Kasia Borowska, and Kasia is the Managing Director at Brainpool AI. And we're going to be talking about data bias and ethics within AI, a topic that I'm really interested in, and I know, Kasia, you are too. So before we go into the detail of this episode today, do you just want to introduce yourself to the listeners of this podcast and let them know about your background and what you do at Brainpool?
Sure. Thank you, Scott. And thank you very much for inviting me to join your podcast today. So I've been a managing director and co-founder of Brainpool AI for the past 3.5 years. So pretty much since the beginning of existence of our startup. So Brainpool, in short, is a global network of over 500 AI and machine learning experts. And our mission is to bridge the gap between academia and corporations. My personal background is in mathematics and cognitive science, and being close to academia, I realized how little access and knowledge of the latest research in cognitive science, AI, machine learning to corporations actually have. So the mission behind Brainpool is really to facilitate that access to some of the top brains and the latest research in the areas of AI.
It's kind of like crowdsourcing the entry to AI.
Pretty much. So the initial version of our startup was to simply be that platform that links the two worlds, so the world of academia and the world of corporations. We then quickly realized that corporations need a little bit more hand-holding when it comes to applying artificial intelligence technologies within their corporations. So we became more of a consultancy. So now Brainpool provides full end-to-end strategy, consultancy, and then also deployment of AI solutions, which are always powered by our researchers, engineers, and data scientists within the Brainpool network.
It's interesting because AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, they feel like topics, me as a marketer, they're topics I'm familiar with, but I think to most marketers in particular, they can feel inaccessible. It's hard to know where to get started. And kind of a spoiler alert, we're going to be recording another episode about the application of marketing within AI for another podcast that I host, the Internet Marketing Podcast. So we'll go into that in a lot more detail in that podcast. But I'm curious to know from your perspective, do you think that gap still exists today? So you mentioned that Brainpool's mission is to kind of provide easier access to specialists in AI. Do you still think there's a big gap between what marketers, what entrepreneurs want to achieve, and then their ability to actually use AI to achieve it?
Yes, I think the gap definitely is getting closer. It's getting smaller and smaller over time, but it's definitely still there. So one of the initial areas I got personally interested in is applications of cognitive science in marketing. So we know that there is so much research out there, for example, on attitudes to shopping behavior, on choice reduction, on risk aversion. All of that research that's currently being done by academics and PhDs at universities can be directly applicable to better shape marketing strategies for some of the huge brands. But it so happened that in order to actually find out whether any of that research is being used, I left academia after my master's degree and I went to work for one of the biggest marketing agencies. And I realized firsthand that marketers don't really have any access to any of the research in cognitive science, and it's purely left out on a theoretical level. And unfortunately, most of the research never even sees the daylight and just ends up in professors' drawers without actually being implemented in any way in the business world. So that was the first idea of creating Brainpools, to give marketers that access to the research in cognitive science. And then from there we expanded to other areas of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And as you probably know, machine learning is being used in pretty much every industry, and most organizations have started or are about to start talking about how machine learning and AI should be implemented within their business. But there is still a huge knowledge gap and a lot of work that needs to be done to educate business managers and commercial teams in terms of what are the actual benefits of AI and how it should be implemented to maximize the positive impact that it can have on their business.
And we're going to be talking about both probably machine learning and also AI in this episode. But one thing that drives me crazy, I imagine it must drive you crazy too, is that there is a distinction between machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I think that artificial intelligence, just particularly within the marketing industry, from what I see, it gets overused as a term to describe new features when actually it's not artificial intelligence at all. Sometimes it could just be machine learning, or sometimes it just could be predictive analytics. So could you maybe provide a basic description of the distinction between AI and ML?
No, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, AI became this huge buzzword now. When I started my marketing career, it used to be big data. And I remember the way the managers and the commercial teams used to represent big data would be to draw a box, and then the data being put in a box, and the amount of data would be so huge they would just start flowing out of the box, and the box would eventually expand and blow up. So that used to be the description of big data, just a lot of data basically. But now obviously we moved on to talk about artificial intelligence. And so, unfortunately, the way the term is being used is anywhere where the company uses data in any way, they tend to call it artificial intelligence. Whereas in reality, artificial intelligence is a way for us to try to imitate human behavior. So there is a term also that's maybe not, it's not as popular. It's called artificial general intelligence, and this is what most people think should think about when they think about robots. So artificial general intelligence is where AI becomes so smart that it can apply intelligence from one narrow area of AI and to predict or behave or find its way in a completely new area. So similar to the way our brains work, we can learn from experiences in one situation and then apply those learnings to another situation. So at the moment, we don't have AGI doesn't exist, and we are still many years away from getting to that point. AI, or as we call it, narrow AI, is built to solve one particular problem, and that's the current state of where we are. So we program our AI systems to solve one particular task, be it machine vision to recognize an object in a picture, or natural language processing to recognize the content of text. And when we talk about machine learning, you can think about machine learning being a toolbox of AI. So there are many different machine learning algorithms that we can use to build the more complex artificial intelligence systems. But it's all still very narrow, and it's really just a way for us to solve one particular task that we have designed the AI or machine learning tool to complete.
Brilliant. Thanks for that distinction. I think that really helps us to, as we're talking, to understand the differences. It's also one of the most difficult places to know where to start, because people are being given so many different phrases but using them interchangeably, and that also doesn't help when you're trying to distinct between these things and knowing where to start.
Absolutely, and that's also one of the things we often start with our clients is trying to explain to them what is it that they actually need, because oftentimes our clients come to us and say, oh, we want to implement artificial intelligence or machine learning solutions. And then what we realize is that they don't need any AI solutions. All they need is a robust data infrastructure, maybe a few
Right.
mathematical models to help them figure out what to do with their data. And they're way off from needing artificial intelligence. So it's important to just take it step by step and get your data sorted first before you start thinking about applying the latest AI, deep learning technologies.
That's really interesting. So at Brainpool, can it be quite difficult to qualify customers because you probably get such a broad range of queries?
Yeah, I mean, we always start with a scoping program. So that's where we come in and really work very closely with the client's technical teams to identify what's actually possible to achieve within their current status of the data infrastructure and within their organization. So we always start with looking at the data because, in essence, unless you have a sufficient amount of data, it's quite difficult to achieve a lot of the things that the client tasks you to do. So we don't want to overpromise anything that's not actually feasible to be implemented. So the first point that we always start with is looking at the data architecture, and only then, once we see that there is enough data and the data is organized in a way that's possible for us to analyze and to build machine learning systems on, only then we move on to designing the machine learning strategy. But you're right, the variety of different industries, clients, and problems that we've looked at is huge.
And I think as you're talking through, not only is the distinction between terminology important, but when I think about artificial intelligence, and really why we're talking today about this topic, is for me personally, I feel pretty strongly about the fact that artificial intelligence is quite powerful. And as it becomes easier to apply artificial intelligence and build artificial intelligence backed projects, that's quite dangerous if we don't take into consideration the education around not only what's possible, but also the risks. So, for example, the bias. So just moving into that area of data biases and biases in general that you're conscious of, could you maybe explain, let's say, for example, a client or a prospect comes to Brainpool AI, they have a project that you think you could work on for them. Is the process of teaching them or educating them about bias something that you offer, something that you do as part of, you just talked about, as part of the AI strategy?
Mm-hmm. No, that's one of the most important things that we offer and we do. And we feel that Brainpool is very well placed to guide clients through that journey to build bias-free, robust AI solutions, due to the fact that we have all these academics in the Brainpool network. A lot of the members of the Brainpool network come from some of the best AI hubs in the world. So Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, Stanford. A lot of them have PhDs and postdocs. And so why that's important is that those academics are able to understand the mathematical background behind an AI solution. So unfortunately, what happened these days is there are a lot of self-taught data scientists who are good engineers and they can get the job done. But a lot of the time, they would just apply ready-made machine learning libraries in Python without actually understanding what those machine learning libraries are doing. And a result of that can be really dangerous because it can basically guide a corporation to the wrong direction, drawing wrong conclusions from the data that they analyze. And the biases that come out of it, you probably heard about them on the news. There are gender biases, biases related to the skin color, to ethnicity, nationality, and all the rest. So it's really important to start with to really fully analyze the data set before you go into applying any machine learning libraries. And one of the main things that needs to be done is to make sure that the data set you're analyzing, so your data sample, is representative of the total population that you want to draw conclusions on, because that's one of the biggest problems. If you say you're lacking certain ethnicity from your data set, and that's when things happen, like what happened to Apple when their facial recognition didn't recognize black faces, when the CVs are biased towards certain nationality or names. So there's countless examples of this happening within corporations. And so a lot of businesses and the clients we talk to unfortunately got burned on especially the early adopters that didn't really get a full understanding of the processes that they need to follow in order to really build robust AI solutions, got burned and spent huge amounts of money on AI systems that give them very little value. So I think now we're going to that second wave of businesses really understanding and taking their time to build robust AI strategies and ensuring that enough data pre-processing is done up front before any machine learning is really being applied. And all of that Brainpool members can really help with.
There's some really interesting information there. Could you maybe break down for, let's say there's a listener that's listening to this and they don't quite know how machine learning or artificial intelligence works. So there's a process. You just talked about the example about maybe a data scientist or maybe a marketer who's familiar. They can maybe get a machine learning library and then start to use that to create models. Can you explain why that's a problem? So maybe if we go back to the process of even as early as data labeling, because that for me is the root where there's two things that are the root problem for me. One is however data is labeled, you need to eliminate bias at that point. And then in the strategic planning of a project, you need to eliminate bias and think about bias at that point. Could you maybe speak through that process and what you see? So do you see on a regular basis in your field lots and lots of, again, data scientists, marketers, entrepreneurs going out and trying to create products and just taking these databases of information without considering where they're built from? Is that what you see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we definitely have had situations like this within our business where we had to remove bias from our data sets or adapt our data sets to match different kinds of situations to the ones for which they were built. To give you an example, we recently built a tool that optimizes the process of building timber structures. So essentially, that tool builds you a timber floor with a click of button. And it was built by applying UK regulations on timber structures. And we then wanted to sell this product to clients in North America, so in Canada and the US. And we realized that actually the floors are not optimized whatsoever to match the buildings in North America, because the codes, the compliance checks, integrity checks are completely different to the ones applied in the UK. So we're now in process of readapting all the algorithms to be able to supply the optimal solutions for our clients in these other regions as well. So that's kind of the latest example of how a bias or a different set of data or compliance checks can completely change the results of the algorithms and the desired outcomes. But in general, when it comes to the process of the initial process of data labeling and data pre-processing, I guess one simple way to understand is that in order to draw conclusions on the population or on the topic you want to analyze, you need to have a sample of information about every element of that topic. So, for example, if you want to analyze, say, shoes, you need to have an example of trainers, of high heels, of boots, and of all the different types of shoes. Because if you don't feed examples of all of these different types of shoes into your machine learning algorithm, then you can train an algorithm to recognize shoes. But if you didn't give it examples of high heels, it won't recognize high heels as being shoes. Your machine learning algorithm say, "Oh, these are not shoes," because I've never seen anything like this, and it looks nothing like the trainers and the boots and all the other examples you've given me. So that's just to make it more visual. You need to make sure that if you want to draw conclusions on the topic of what are shoes, then you need to give it all the different examples. So if you want to say draw conclusions or on who would be a good politician, then you need to give all examples of all politicians across all genders and all different types of areas of politics, and make sure that you remove any statistical biases from the dataset itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting as you're talking, because I can see why it's so easy to make the mistake. If you're just someone who's curious, like I said, maybe you're a marketer, maybe you're a data analyst, and all you want to do is get started with learning about artificial intelligence. So you use some pre-existing data sets and pre-processed data, and you're just experimenting. Well, that doesn't really harm anyone. But if you're working in a small company and then you're building them a product, you're going to waste your time because you've not considered bias from the start. But what's shocking is that we've seen examples. I think the one that comes to mind primarily is you just talked about Apple actually recently with the Face ID. That comes to mind. But it's kind of scary how big corporations can either, number one, not consider enough or not plan well enough to exclude bias from the start? Or more skeptically, number two, perhaps they're completely aware of the bias and are using it to their advantage. So I guess my question in a roundabout way is, how do you think that can be controlled or policed? Do you think there needs to be higher barriers to entry to access large data sets and utilize artificial intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean that's definitely a big area for discussion, and I personally think that these regulations should come from the top. So there should be government set rules for all corporations to follow certain steps and procedures when it comes to, say, their data pre-processing, in order to consciously remove all the biases that they may be able to find. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, like you said, marketers or businesses really want to find certain trends in their data just to confirm that what their ideas are true or are good. And if you really want to find something in the data, the chances are that you will find it, because there is hundreds of different ways in which you can analyze one same data set. And if you're not careful, or if you shift your algorithm to fit with the data in a certain way, chances are you'll be able to do it. And obviously, you then end up with a biased result that confirms your theory, which is what I think a lot of the kind of early stage data scientists wannabes are currently doing. So I think really this regulation should come from the top, and everyone should follow the same procedure before being able to draw any conclusions from the data set they're analyzing.
Interesting. And I actually had planned on asking you this, so it's interesting that you touch on this as a subject. I don't actually know if there are regulations in place in the UK for the use of artificial intelligence products or services. I assumed it being at Brainpool, you'll know that. But yeah, are you familiar, particularly in the UK and the US, are you aware if there are any government regulations that apply to this industry, or doesn't that exist?
The government started applying regulations, and at the moment they are very generic and top
Right.
level. They've not really been set by machine learning experts, which is what I think is necessary.
Yeah.
So I think the first set of them has been released a few years ago, and we're still waiting now for the actual detailed regulations to be able to guide our data engineers, because those really have to be provided by data engineers to data engineers, because um,
Mm.
otherwise, it's not going to be specific enough for us to be able to inform our teams on what actually needs to be done. But I hope that it will be released. And one of the things that is becoming really problematic in this topic is that in order for it really to make sense, those regulations need to be rolled out by all countries simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because if you think about a situation where UK has strict regulations when it comes to data preprocessing and building machine learning solutions, whereas China doesn't, then China is going to triple the speed in terms of the development of machine learning versus any of the other countries that applied those regulations, and that obviously can end badly for everyone. So it's really important that all countries come together and come up with international regulations for the development of machine learning solutions, which I know it's not an easy task, but that's what we're hoping will happen.
Well, I think the downside is, and this is really hard to think about, but it needs to happen, because if it doesn't happen, as you've pointed out, and maybe we can speak on this a little bit if you've got any other examples, but what it ends up impacting is it ends up creating race or gender bias in everyday life. And those outcomes, those circumstances are huge. And so something needs to happen to prevent that becoming a bigger issue. At the moment, perhaps there have been a few isolated instances, but as access to artificial intelligence and the tools to create artificial intelligence products and the learning around it increases, it's going to become a bigger problem, and quite rapidly. And so something needs to happen, I would assume, at a government level to make that change.
No, absolutely. I mean, there are some institutions like Max Tegmark, who's a professor at MIT. He created this Institute of AI, I think it's called, which was joined by Stephen Hawking and all the Elon Musk and all the other biggest brains. Their mission is to to ensure that the AI systems we build are aligned with our human goals. So they are all really scared that AI is going to take over, and we are just a means to an end. So the human race was designed to essentially give birth to the next species, which is the AI. So that's one of the scary theories. So what they're really keen to do is build a network of AI experts and scientists that do research in the area of how do we align AI's goals with our human goals to avoid a situation where we're just basically destroyed by our product in the future.
Well, that sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
Is there any aspect of this that we're talking about that worries you? So are you worried to the level that you're worried that our own products will destroy us? Or do you just worry on a more personal level? For example, gender. Gender is one that I see stand out immediately because I only have a kind of entry to intermediate level experience of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I'm not in it every day. But I see race considered, and I think there's a more of an awareness growing around race. I still don't think there's a great awareness around gender. I'm just curious to know from your perspective if that's something that you agree with or disagree with.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm definitely very much surrounded by that topic of gender bias, especially in the world of AI, when
Yeah.
there is not many females just yet, although it is growing. Yeah, no, definitely that's one of the big problems. And I think there is a good example that I recently heard. But one of the problems is that people that analyze data sets don't really take the full story into consideration. And that's what often results in incorrect conclusions when it comes to gender. So I'll give you an example. So there was a study that was showing that female CEOs are more likely to fail in big corporations of say I think it was over 3,000 people. And there were clear results showing, this is the amount of male CEOs that failed, and this is the amount of female CEOs, and obviously the rate at which female CEOs were failing was higher. And then what they found later on is that actually what was happening is that female CEOs were more likely to accept CEO roles in companies that were already going bankrupt, just because they're more prone to take that risk, because obviously the whole journey is so much harder for them. So that was the main reason why, and that the main impact and factor was that, and rather than the fact that they were that particular gender. And so not taking the whole story into consideration is one of the big problems these days. And that's why I can't stress enough how important it is to really do your due diligence when looking at the data and try to take all of the different data points into consideration rather than just looking at, say, one thing such as gender.
That's really interesting. That's a great example as well. And again, I have a maybe basic to intermediate understanding. I know that some models can be built from pre-existing data, and I assume you work on some projects at Brainpool where you're building models from scratch using new data. So do you have a team of data labelers alongside your team of AI specialists? And when you outsource that work to data labelers, how do you train them on the aspect of bias?
So no, we don't provide labeling services. Actually, most of the companies that I know of, especially the bigger ones like Google's, they all offshore the process of data labeling. So there are whole villages in Africa and India and other countries of people literally spending days in and out labeling data, which is not the kind of the greatest job you can imagine, but I
No.
guess it's. I hope that they're doing it in an ethical way. When it comes to the process of data labeling, we normally just leave that to the client to provide us the accurate data. Obviously, the client, knowing their business, knowing their industry, they are best placed to accurately label the data that they provide. So we normally expect the client to take that on board themselves, and then we come in the point in which the data is clearly labeled and delivered to us, and then we can do the whole work in terms of ensuring that the biases are removed and the data processing is done properly before the machine learning implementation takes place.
And on the topic of, maybe you spoke about a project that maybe was misinterpreted because of how because of the data that went into it. Can you speak on any AI projects that you've seen that you thought had real potential to be very useful, but they didn't work because there was inherent data bias in the data that it was created from?
There's one project that I'm thinking of right now, which I thought was a great idea, and then it didn't actually pick up. But I'm not sure whether it was because of a bias or basically data being too random. So we helped a company, I think it was about a year and a half, 2 years ago, build a personalized baby crib. This is one of a unique projects for us. But essentially, what that the client was trying to do is build a crib that reacts according to the cues given by by the particular baby. So the crib itself would say move and play different sounds and light up in different colors, and then based on whether the baby is crying or laughing or anything else that the baby does, it would learn its behavior and adapt itself to, say, play different types of music or move quicker or slower. And so that project I never actually heard of becoming big, and I wonder whether it's because babies just cry at random times in the day. No, I'm not an expert on this topic, but that's one example of, as much as you can have the whole infrastructure, everything perfectly set up to draw conclusions on the subjects that you're trying to analyze. It sometimes is just not possible because of the level of random cues that are given to you by that data source. So that's one example, I guess.
That's amazing. That's a really interesting project. Yeah, like you said, very, very unique.
Yeah.
And on a very, very similar train of thought, and feel free to share. I know sometimes you have clients that can't share information and stuff like that, but are there any projects that you've worked on at Brainpool or out in the wild that you've seen where you know that they really spent a lot of time on data bias and invested a lot in the ethics and data bias of the project that they're working on? Because if they didn't do that, the outcome would be quite dramatic.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to be honest with you, all clients should always do that
Yeah, of course.
as a general rule. But maybe one example that comes to mind right now is obviously any government that is trying to apply machine learning solutions need to do a huge level of due diligence when it comes to their data. We recently started working with the Canadian government with the forestry department. It did an initial scoping exercise trying to help them design that strategy for efficient forestry systems in Canada. And there's a huge level of data pre-processing that we need to go into that project there. But I would say, yeah, definitely within government is one sector that needs to look into these things very closely.
And on the flip side of this, I guess a real positive, because it's really easy to create a bad data set. If you put in the work if you put in the work to label data correctly and you create a really accurate, non-biased model, then in theory, you can use gender, race, sexuality, whatever it is, for positive good as well. In theory, what can be used for bad can also be used for good. So do you have any examples that come to mind for you about how artificial intelligence could be used for good?
I'm not sure that's the right way of thinking about this, because essentially, data is data, and if analyzed correctly, it should give you one answer. And so, basically manipulating your data to get an answer you need for bad or for good, I think is just wrong. So
Right, yeah. It's the inherent question that's wrong, isn't it? It's the looking for something as an outcome rather than just utilizing the data. That makes sense.
Exactly, that's it. So literally, like I was saying, if you want to find something in your data, you will find it. And it's just about, rather than trying to find what you want, is to be specific about the way in which you handle your data and follow all the rules and make sure, do all the statistical checks, and then on the back of it, find the actual answer that comes out of your data without any of the biases that might be coming from yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the question comes from the marketer in me as well, which as a marketer, I'm always looking to take advantage of something like that. And if I have a presupposed outcome, it's very easily to fall into the trap of thinking how you might utilize it for positive, negative, or whatever you want the outcome to be. And I guess that, so on that topic, actually, and moving into the conversation about utilization of AI in marketing, as you talked at the very beginning, or maybe before we started recording, you have a marketing background yourself. And I'm curious to know whether you've seen the use of artificial intelligence in marketing, in any bad examples where it's been used incorrectly, and something that is maybe particularly concerning for you from a marketing perspective.
So I would say that the usage of machine learning in marketing is not the problem itself. Problem is with the way that the data is being collected and handled by some of the tech giants. So, the Facebook, for example, what they do is they collect data on every single thing we do on the web, within Facebook and outside of Facebook, and then they have more information about us than our parents and partners, and essentially they use that information to feed us advertising on products that they think we will want to buy. Essentially, what happens is that we are all a product of Facebook that they sell to advertisers. So they are very proficient in the way in which they run their machine learning algorithms. They know exactly what they're doing on that front. But the ethical question here becomes, why are we giving them all this data for free? Why are we not generating money from our own data? Why are they making so much money from selling essentially our souls and all the information about us?
And do you think it's going to be possible for that to change? Because at the moment, that aspect of privacy doesn't look achievable.
I hope so. I really hope we come to our senses and stop using these platforms. I have, and it's essentially, I think it's just a matter of time. There are already platforms such as there's a platform that's trying to substitute Chrome called Brave, and from what I know, the way it works is they give users money for the ads, for the clicks on ads, rather than Google giving kind of making all of that money from the advertisers, and advertisers making money from selling random objects to random people. Yeah, there will be a shift in the mindset, but it needs to really come from the users, from all of us.
And that's something I wanted to ask you, actually. So you're probably more conscious of how your data is used than the average person on the street. So I wanted to ask, is there anything that you do specifically to limit big corporations' access to your data? You've just talked about one web browser, for example, but is there anything else that you do?
I'm definitely not the best example. I know people that are much better at it than me, but definitely raising your own awareness of how that all works is useful. So I guess just to explain the level of detail that it goes into, the marketers have access to the information not only about what you do on Facebook and all the other websites, and the websites you browse, how long you spend on each topic, and all of that, but they also know from a physical world, thanks to the tracking systems they have on your phone, through all the apps that you download and you accept terms and conditions of without actually reading them, they know where you live, they know where you work, they know where you go to restaurants, where you play golf, what sports you do, the kind of people you meet. Literally every single thing that you do is being tracked. So obviously, turning off your GPS or location function on your phone can help. Although I'm not sure if that's still helpful now, but obviously, but we can't. We also have to live our normal lives without being paranoid. So I would say, whenever you buy something, just really think: do you really need it, or is this an influence of a smart marketing strategy? And that's really where our decisions can be influenced by our reasoning rather than all the machine learning algorithms being used by marketers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one thing I'm curious about is we didn't touch on it at the beginning. It's just come to mind for me that you've had to go through this process of learning so much, I assume, yourself about not only AI, ML, bias, even the aspect of running an agency that deals with client queries around these topics. How have you educated yourself through this process, and how do you continue to educate yourself in such an ever-changing and rapidly developing industry?
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely, it's a huge learning curve for me, and
Mm.
it still is. I have a degree in maths, which is definitely helpful. It's always a good starting point for anyone that wants to go into machine learning. But in terms of AI, there are many online courses that you can do. I know that there are quite a few good ones on Udemy. Dr. Andrew Ng, the ex-CEO of Bing, is teaching a really good introduction to machine learning course on there, which I did a while ago. I know there's quite a few good resources on Coursera if you just want to grasp like the basics of programming. But really, I came to terms that I'm never gonna become an expert AI or deep learning engineer myself. So unfortunately, but I'm very interested in this topic, so I try to continuously learn every day, and I'm lucky enough to have 500 AI experts in the Brainpool network that can help me and teach me as much as possible. But really, so there's a lot of online resources. If you are curious about this topic, then I'm sure you can find where to learn from.
That must be really inspiring and also sometimes really challenging to work in an environment where you've got 500 experts in that area.
Oh, definitely. I often feel like I'm the least intelligent person in any room that I go into, but I prefer it this way because it's just very, very interesting, and I learn something new every day. So it's great. I love it.
Has anything caught your attention in terms of? I'm interested to know what makes you excited about the future of artificial intelligence. And when I think about kind of what makes me excited, I think it's the anticipation of not knowing where our AI could go. And then sometimes it's thinking about efficiencies in life and efficiencies that it can support with. And I'm just curious to know from your perspective, are there any particular projects that you've seen that someone's working on, or any world problems that you think artificial intelligence could be used to solve and that are being solved at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a huge topic,
Mm.
huge question. I would say rather than excited, I'm just really curious and a little
Mm.
nervous, I would say, about what's going to come. I'm definitely sure that AI would transform everything in the next, say, 50, 100 years. One big question that I'm pondering recently is the whole system being structured around us working. So, with
Mm.
AI being able to replace most of the manual tasks, and basically we'll be able to automate most of the current jobs and responsibilities that we currently do in our day-to-day jobs. I wonder, are our lives still going to be based on, the kind of 9 to 5, and is our main responsibility in life going to be to have a career and make money, or maybe what will AI will enable us to do is to forget all that. We won't have to work, but instead, maybe what we should focus on is how to save our planet from
Mm.
total destruction. So that would become our day-to-day task for all human beings on the planet, which I think would be a great shift of focus. But who knows?
Yeah, it's kind of a race against time, isn't it? That's a fascinating way to think about it. What comes first? Does the end of the planet come first, or does our efficiency through AI manage to get to a point where it stops that from happening? It's
Yeah.
such an interesting thing to ponder. You've been an amazing guest. There's so much information that you've shared. Can you let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and Brainpool?
For sure. Thank you very, very much, Scott. It's been a very interesting conversation. So, for anyone that's interested in artificial intelligence or machine learning, or learning more about it, but also perhaps applying it to your business, go to brainpool.ai and just get in touch with one of us. We're always keen to speak to new businesses, new potential clients, but also data scientists and researchers. So, we're happy to connect.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Kasia and I are going to be recording an episode specifically about applications of AI in marketing. So if you want to check that out, you'll find that at sitevisibility.co.uk. That's on the other podcast that I host, the Internet Marketing Podcast. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again shortly.
Thank you very much, Scott. Look forward to it. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.